Booknotes, the television program, started in April of 1989. Our third guest that month was the late journalist Bruce Oudes. His book was titled From the President, Richard Nixon's Secret Files. Because the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in is on June 17th, it seemed appropriate to revisit Mr. Oudes' book, which contained over 600 pages of previously unreleased memoranda from Richard Nixon and aides during the 6 years of his presidency. Bruce Oudes took a deep dive into boxes of over 3.5 million pages of material that was being housed at a government warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia.
What's in this 661-page book?
Many of the memoranda written by Richard Nixon and by members of his staff during the course of the Nixon presidency.
How did you get it?
Went down to the Archives Annex on Pickett Street in Alexandria, a rather nondescript warehouse where they're presently being stored, and began working with these documents in the summer of 1987 when they were released, when Richard Nixon decided not to further contest the release of these documents.
How many memoranda or memorandums are there in there in this book?
Well, a lot. And one way of looking at it, if a member of the public were to go down there and start pulling out of the boxes and ordering up reproduction copies of the pages in this, the reader would spend more than $500 just in reproduction user fee charges alone for these documents. And so it's a bargain at the price, if I can get in a sales pitch. But what I did, what I saw first of all, is that simply that Richard Nixon, whether you love him or whether you hate him, is one of the most prolific writers of memoranda in the history of the presidency. And I tend to feel he's still championed to this day. He dictated in some days as many as 2 to 3 dozen memos in a single day, or single night or weekend. He usually worked nights or weekends, and he wrote these in a burst. Would dictate a number of them. Of course, the system now has changed in the White House a bit. It's much of what was done in hard copy in Nixon's time is now run through computers, but and word processors. But still, there's a lot of hard copy material being generated in the White House, and it provides a very precise record of what happened. And essentially what this book has is the core of it is better than 95%, I would judge, of the memos written by Mr. Nixon that have been released to date.
Your book has 95% of the memos
right,
that have been released today.
I looked in all of the places that were most likely in those archives. Keep in mind they released 3.2 million pages in 1987, and I haven't been through all 3.2 million pages. I've been through many hundreds of thousands of pages, but it was simply not physically possible. I do continue to find, as I continue to work at the archives, a memo written by Nixon that on very rare occasion, one every 3 or 4 months now, but the great bulk of them are in this book. And then, of course, on top of that, what we saw after we looked at the memos were a lot of very interesting staff memos, and written by primarily Patrick Buchanan and Charles Colson and H.R. Bob Haldeman. And so the logical way to deal with that simply was to arrange them in chronological order. And they tell a story that way of a presidency from beginning to end. And in Nixon's case, of course, in the case of several of our recent presidents, it was not particularly happy ending. But you do build to a climax of considerable dimension in the early summer of 1972, late spring with the Watergate break-ins. And there was a great deal of paper that flowed through. I tried to leave as much of that paper flow, get as much of that into the book as possible, particularly from those first 6 months of 1972. What happened is that after James McCord started to sing, as it were, tell his story to the courts in May or in April of, I believe it was, of 1973, Richard Nixon simply stopped dictating memoranda. I think there were 2 in the final 16 months of his presidency, and I've checked with the archives. There are no further Nixon memoranda to come out from that period. There are some others from the earlier period that will come out. Many are being still held, of course, for national security classification reasons. And then there's the other concept, which is the fact that Mr. Nixon requested in '87 that 150,000 pages be withheld. And the archives, under reasons which are granted in effect by the Supreme Court in its 1977 ruling, and the archives, rather than challenge that, went along with that request and is on a temporary basis pending the outcome of a review that is now underway, is due to be completed sometime, I gather, before the end of this year.
Let me change subject a little bit. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Chicago and grew up there, and went to Northwestern, where I majored in journalism. And the idea of doing a book like this really grows out of my background and experience in journalism, and I think it's a somewhat new concept. We've had books before by historians of documents of Truman's letters, of various presidential papers, often long after the fact, and not edited to try to tell the whole story of the presidency as much as this is. And I would dearly have loved to have had this on the market, also one on Jimmy Carter by the time of the 1988 election, but that just simply was not physically possible. But that concept grows out of that, and I've spent time, I was in the Foreign Service overseas in the 1960s and promoted twice. I wanted to learn what the inside, the paper flow of a bureaucracy, I suppose that was my fascination. And then I've been back in Washington and living in the Washington area for the last nearly 20 years now.
What do you do when you're not writing books?
Spend my time in archives looking at documents.
Did you ever work for a newspaper?
I covered Africa for the Chicago Daily News and Time magazine in the late 60s. And then once I came back, spent some time at Columbia University under what was at that point their equivalent of the Neiman program in 69, 70. And then I've been freelancing in Washington ever since. So I sold pieces to, you name it, I've sold it there. And for the last decade or so, as I've been poking around, I'm working primarily on a book on Richard Nixon's foreign policy, and in a sense, this was a spin-off from that project. I was there when the herd came in, the press, during, at the opening, of the time these papers were opened in 1987. I was there quietly working on my Nixon foreign policy book, and I expected that at least the major news organizations would assign someone who would, or a team of reporters who would sit down and sift through these papers for a series of articles that would be produced on a fairly orderly basis, given all of the fascination with Richard Nixon and his secret files and one thing and another. And instead what happened was they came in, stayed for 1, 2, or 3 days, and everybody left. And I was there alone working on my book, all by myself. And I said, well, here's all of these presidential memoranda. Certainly someone needs to get this out in the public domain. And I think anyone who reads this book fairly carefully can figure out from his or herself, if they're a journalist, precisely what kinds of articles that one might produce for a series, a newspaper series that could have appeared in 1987. But this didn't happen. I mean, one could have done an article on Nixon's memos, what he had to say. Then there's other things, the fact that the plumber's papers, 9 boxes, 230 file folders, are missing, have not been seen since 1974, were supposed to have been released in 1987, but we still don't have even a determination by the Justice Department, for all I know, that these might have been illegally shredded or stolen, and I don't know that they've even launched a criminal investigation in this. I mean, Oliver North is accused of pretty much the same thing. He's admitted his shredding. We know what happened there, but there were plenty of stories, in other words, to go at. And one of the other stories was, of course, the fact that inadvertently the archives managed to release some of the pages that Richard Nixon would have preferred to be withheld.
Like?
Well, I've carefully marked them in the book, so the reader can go through and decide for himself which he thinks should have been withheld and which Richard Nixon might have been overreacting on.
Have you marked the ones that...
They're indicated there. If you begin from the very beginning, at the very first memoranda that I use in the book after the editor's note, you'll see that the
This one?
That one there is a memo that Richard Nixon asked to be withheld, and this is so indicated. If we can flip over,
sure.
Here, you see where my finger is, right there.
What's it say there?
It says withdrawn from PPF-1 at the request of Richard Nixon. PPF-1 means President's Personal File, Box number 1, at the request of Richard Nixon. However, you find a copy of that memo in H.R. Haldeman's files, Box 229. Now you can, I happen to have reasonable grounds for believing that to be the case from a simple technique that I employed, which was to obtain also a photocopy of the list of documents that Nixon asked to be withheld. And so I know the date of a particular document that requested be withheld, who it's from, who it's to, what the subject matter is, or at least the first 3 words of the memo in question. And from there is a 99.99% certainty when one finds a memo which fits that description that it is the memo in fact. And I've have confirmed from my sources in the archives that they were aware that some might be seeping through, but they were asked to do this process of removing 150,000 pages from this 3.2 million page collection in a space of a very few weeks. And of course, by the time Richard Nixon was president, the photocopying technology was widespread, and there were just copies of these things all in several boxes.
Harper and Row published this. How did you convince them to do it?
Well, actually it was my agent who did so, but they were intrigued. They showed them examples of the memos, and they had no problem whatsoever in reaching a decision that it was time to publish this stuff.
Back in '87, you talked about the press coming in for a couple of days. Can you remember how many people you saw going through the memos?
There were quite a few. Actually, the days when there was the heaviest concentrations, I tried to stay away. I would ask when the archivist, you know, well, the collection is opening on Monday and Tuesday, and I would call up and says, how bad is the mob in the room? And she says, oh, we've got a full house today. And then I said, well, I'll come in on Wednesday. I'd come in on Wednesday, and they were pretty much gone. I did see a few people going through, but I gather it was it was quite a scene, and a scene worth covering in and of itself. You almost have a television camera in there covering it, because what you get, there's a room with, let's see, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 9 tables there, and one desk for the archivist to sit there overseeing the room and the handling. The papers have to be handled, of course, in a rather careful fashion. But one got the wire services in there, and everybody getting all excited. You know, here, I've got one, I've got a hot one, and somebody else, you know, trying to keep each other. And these boxes have to be handled in a manner, and of course they're all on deadline, having to file before the day is out, and trying to figure out when to file, and all of that process, which you can understand. Now, you know, the wires are the wires. I worked for City News Bureau in Chicago a little bit before Cy Hirsch did. So I understand the problem of the wire services. I've had to, I remember in my days in Africa, I had to sometimes walk through the night to the single cable office in town when a taxi couldn't be found. But it seems to me with presidential papers that it would be appropriate for the press to really take someone who perhaps, say, covered the Nixon administration. The New York Times, for instance, sent John Finney there to head its team, but they took a look at this volume of paper, and realizing that the 150,000 pages were withheld, they were, and I do think there's a lot more to be found in those 150,000 pages, but then they didn't do the logical thing, was to say, well, let's take a look and see what is there anyway.
Are you glad?
Well, I'm glad in the sense that I was able to get a book out of it, sure. But, you know, there's an irony in all of this. Remember that the New York Times, during the Pentagon Papers dispute, which, remember, the Pentagon Papers in 1971 were primarily agency documents, State Department, Pentagon, what have you. They were not Lyndon Johnson's presidential memoranda by any stretch of the imagination. And everyone got all excited about the release of these. And Richard Nixon certainly overreacted, but at that time. But the argument of the Times in publishing those, I think, was absolutely correct. There is no question the Times, Washington Post, and others, once a bureaucrat, a government employee, had made the decision to put these out, the press should not be responsible for determining whether given documents, a set of documents that is given, are the release of those is authorized or unauthorized. That's something for government to take care of itself. But it seems to me that it is appropriate for the press, which thrives certainly on unauthorized release of materials, and sits in a courthouse, for instance, in Oliver North day after day looking for another document or two, to at least give serious treatment to major releases of presidential materials. And you're not going to have very many more newsworthy figures, newsworthy releases of materials than the special files of Richard Nixon. Remember that, and this leads to the next question. I'll take it right out of your mouth. But these files were created in September of 1972 by, upon Nixon's instructions. The materials physically were taken out of the White House central files and were located into what was called the White House special files. Now that meant that when there were inquiries from Congress or whomever about what the White House records showed in 71 and early 72 or later, that the White House could respond that, well, nothing is to be found on subject X in the White House, or we're giving you everything there is to be found on subject X in the White House central files. Meanwhile, of course, all the good stuff would be over in the White House special files. And so therefore there was an enormous interest when this was discovered during the Watergate period that the special files had been created. It's meant that you had an enormous interest in this particular file. Richard Nixon has, incidentally, done the same thing, once again, with another round of this, by identifying these 150,000 pages now out of the 3.2 million as the hottest stuff. And so I'm sure the mob has no choice, but if and when those 150,000 pages are released, that is the other 99% that I don't have in my book, to be down at the archives and be there. I think it would be marvelous for C-SPAN just to cover the scene in that research room when the mob goes in there. I think the nation would howl with laughter.
When's it going to happen?
That's a very good question. If Richard Nixon decides not to sue, let's see, the review process, let me back up for a second. The review process will continue throughout the course of this year, and presumably the archives, I would guess, review panel will probably agree with Richard Nixon's conclusion, that is the conclusion of his attorneys, on perhaps 10% or so of the 150,000 pages. And Richard Nixon's people, in turn, may agree with the archives on perhaps 10% or so of the materials. And there will be a disagreement on perhaps a substantial majority, the whole perhaps 60, 70, 80%, we don't know. At that point, Richard Nixon has to decide whether to sue, challenging the judgment of the archives. If he doesn't, then these, in turn, will come open at some point, presumably next year.
Here's August 12th. I just opened it up. August 12th, 1972, from the President. This is written by Richard Nixon, correct? It says from the President.
Okay, right.
To H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff. Covering some odds and ends. Milton Pitts, the barber, has indicated on a couple of occasions that he'd be very glad to go to Florida during the period of the campaign at his own expense. Apparently, he has a brother who lives in Miami, and he would like to go down and visit him for a few days. My guess is that this is probably for personal purposes as much as anything else, but it occurred to me that having taken his predecessor down, and if we have the room, that you might have it arranged for him to go down on one of our planes, not mine, but the understanding that he should not indicate that he is going down for the purpose of providing any services for me. It goes on and on and on. Why did you put that in there?
Because it is readable, because it is substantive, and the memo goes on, I think, doesn't it, for quite a long...
Oh, yeah, it's a very long memo.
Right.
It starts
you
out
have to read off the whole thing.
But it talks about the barber, and I just wondered if that was one of the more humorous things, that you had some irony in that?
Well, in that specific one, the only ones that we did not choose, there were a handful of ones that Nixon wrote that were of strictly, purely administrative nature. Now, this one is a very long one. You'd have to read the whole thing to look into what else he was saying. But Nixon, some of these were, you know, several thousand words in length. Did
you cut any of the memos down themselves?
I think one or two, and we've indicated where one or two have been shortened a little bit, but we've kept in the substance.
Here's another one, August 5th. This comes from Charles Colson to Ken Clausen, who was a press aide. Right. Couldn't we do better than this, question mark. It is incredible to me that this is all we have gotten out of Charlton Heston.
Right, we see campaign techniques. It was of deep concern to me that I regretted that we couldn't have this out during the time of the campaign last year, because we see firsthand the people inside the White House handling the '72 campaign. I mean, this is one way to describe this book, is this is a view from inside the fort in the American Civil War of the 20th century. And we've never really seen the view from inside. All we've seen in the press and everything else that's been written about it is either a single view from inside, which those memoirs are always self-serving, or we've seen the press accounts from outside the barricades. We haven't really seen materials from the inside. One of the things that could be done that hasn't been done, you know, to date with campaigns, I think the most logical thing, we provide a lot of money for the presidential candidates to conduct their campaigns. And there have been several good ideas as to what could be done, and one of which I would strongly favor, which would be no public monies to be used for those 30-second or 1-minute commercials that the only public money could be used for something at least 5 minutes in length, and that would seem to me the beginning of wisdom. But another technique that could be used is saying that any candidate for the presidency who accepts public money should also be required to put the papers of his campaign, collect and save them and not destroy them, and turn them over to the archives for release to the public. There are techniques, in other words, political techniques, which can be used to, if not end the kind of nonsense that took place during the campaign last year, at least limit it to change the rules of the game a bit for the better for the public all concerned.
As you read through this book, one name that keeps coming up all the time is Lou Harris.
Oh, you're the first person to call attention to that one. I've only used part of the Lou Harris memos. There are a lot more over there in Alexandria, if anyone who is wondering about it. I found it one of the most fascinating aspects of the '72 campaign. Lou Harris, of course, is a pollster, and he was putting out some polls in 70 and 71, I believe it was, that were very, that Nixon thought were rather unfair, didn't cast Nixon in as fair a light as possible. So what happened was a campaign to put a bit of political arm on Mr. Harris. He was stroked on the one hand, a trip to Moscow, invitations to the White House, that kind of thing. But by the same token, it's very clear in these memos and materials that he was also threatened with the loss of the contracts that he held with some government agencies. And it is certainly for Mr. Harris himself to say how much he was or was not. He felt influenced by all this pressure, but you see from the documents themselves the fact that there was considerable pressure, and that he certainly, in his responses to the White House, seemed to change his attitude quite substantially before the '72 campaign.
How unhappy is Lou Harris about all this being published? Do you have any idea?
I've never met the man. I've had no contact. I have no idea whatsoever.
And you get an impression when you read that he was known as a Democrat, had worked in the Kennedy years, I believe, early in these memos, and you see, even at one point, you see Pat Buchanan getting upset that Chuck Colson seems to curry favor with Lou Harris, and that he's fooling himself into thinking that he's going to be on their side.
Right, but Chuck turned him around. Right. I appeared on the Today Show, speaking of Chuck Colson, with him on February 15th, and I was delighted to see that he gave a very good commercial for the book. But afterwards, he said, well, he was, as he signed a copy of the book for me, he said that he was glad to see that there were a few memos of his that I hadn't found. I asked him which ones, and he said that they were ones in which he and Buchanan were planning this a campaign to get the president's attention and change his mind on a few things that he and Pat felt were important, and get around Haldeman, the so-called German wall, through the staff layering at the White House. I can't see particularly what's so of such great concern about that, why he would want to keep those out, but for instance, when so much else is out. But he did happen to mention that to me.
Any reaction from Richard Nixon himself about this?
No, and I would certainly welcome it. I sent him a copy of the book together with a letter the first day I received my first copy. And I know that his office knew that I was working on the book. In fact, I discussed it with John Taylor, his aide, when Nixon was in Washington in April of last year, 1988. I mentioned that I was working on the book.
One of the other things that comes through is that, in some of these memos, is that there were those inside the White House who were aides to Richard Nixon, who he personally kept referring to in the memos in less than a positive light, that they weren't really on his side. Leonard Garment seems to come to mind in that process. In the relationship with the media, you keep reading about Herb Klein being on the other side of where Chuck Colson was with the media. What else did you see in there?
Well, there are a number of those cases, and Klein certainly did take his lumps, and as we know, left the administration early on. But the relationship, I've seen them on a couple of occasions, certainly continues to this day. Seems to be, perhaps the publication of this will help reestablish more warmth in the relationship. Klein certainly has remained quite loyal to Nixon throughout his career, and in his own book, Klein is critical of a few things that happened in the '60 campaign. And you know, Herb Klein is probably right in all of these things, and I think as Richard Nixon looks back at what Klein did and was saying and the point of view he was taking on '72, he would have to realize now that Klein was really correct. In his interview with NBC in April of '88, Nixon suggested at one point that he probably had been too rough on the press. It was quite an admission. And that was true. I mean, Nixon, it was a carrot and stick technique that Nixon used on the press. You know, it was Nixon who created the improved conditions of the White House for reporters, and there was a lot of courting of the press. But by the same token, Nixon really used more of a stick than had ever been used before in the press. The Des Moines Speech in '69 that was really written, I suppose, by Buchanan primarily and Spiro Agnew delivered the speech. But it was a carrot and stick technique that was applied, and there are, to a certain degree, that's going to continue. I'm sure it continues in the Bush administration to this day. But there are limits, it seems to me, that to the extent of the technique. And one of the most amazing discoveries I made during the course of doing the book was that, well, what we knew is that their dirty tricks were used against the political opposition during the '72 campaign. And we knew that Nixon hated the press, but we haven't really known, and we've suspected that there may have been dirty tricks used against the press, but not until I see these documents do we really know that dirty tricks were in fact used against the press. And the dirty trick, the procedure specifically, was the use of disinformation, black propaganda against the press. Network anchors, or Dan Rather, or John Chancellor, or someone, Walter Cronkite, would say something that was not particularly appreciated in the White House. The White House would then get out a suggested letter or telephone call memo, which would go over to the Republican National Committee, and then the Republican National Committee would contact its friends around the country, and these people would contact NBC, CBS, ABC, and say that, you know, express their opinion on a given subject without telling NBC, CBS, ABC that they were doing so upon the explicit instructions of the White House. And many of these people didn't know that it was the White House that was doing it. They thought it was the Republican National Committee. Perhaps they could be, they were a bit naive in their own mind. But I think that's really grossly unfair. It's really a lack of civility in the relationship between press and politician for the politicians to use on a systematic basis that technique. The technique in and of itself is the kind of thing that on an informal basis we would use almost every day. You know, we're sitting here talking and you tell me that there is somebody else does something that you don't like. I might say to you, well, write him a letter and call him. That's perfectly normal technique. But when, as was the case in the Nixon administration, the president orders, as he did in 1969, the summer of '69, a specific program to be organized on an organized basis to do this kind of thing regularly and routinely on a large scale, and to do it to the press, I think is goes over the boundary, the line of propriety and civility that we're trying to. Nixon's, the line at the time, as you recall, was that it was lower our voices. Now it's kinder and gentler, but it was lower our voices was the slogan 20 years ago. And that wasn't really a way to lower our, appropriate way to lower our voices.
What most surprised you about Richard Nixon in reading these memos?
Well, I can't say that I was surprised by the depth of his intellect. I find him one of the most fascinating American presidents of this century. I think he'll be remembered as that. That's why I think it's correct, as one reviewer has said, that Nixon lovers will love this book and Nixon haters will love this book also. There's this an incredibly organized ability to see himself as a third person, look at himself and be interested in the marketing of that third person to an extent. And this is perhaps true, goes back to his birth in California, the fact that he was always been interested in the movies from an early age, and so therefore he developed an interest in the media from a very early point in his school years, and in fact took a journalism course at Whittier College, which Stephen Ambrose looked at the grades, discovered he got a C in journalism his freshman year, and maybe that's the origins of his problems with the press. But I think if Nixon thinks back on his career, and I think I've suggested in my cover letter to him that one of the things he should do for posterity's sake would be to do an essay of a length that he would deem appropriate on the press and its appropriate relations, appropriate role in a democracy. He's talked about the press, complained about it throughout his political career, sometimes spoken diplomatically of it, at other times spoken very harshly of it, and it really would be very helpful to historians, and I think it would serve a contemporary purpose if he were to set aside for a moment all of his work on foreign policy and do a serious essay on what are the limits and what should be the limits of the relationship of the politician to the press. That, I think, is a very central thing. As I'm working on his foreign policy, obviously there are a few bits and pieces that come through in Nixon's memos. I find there nothing, you know, Nixon's contention that he would have been able to do a great deal more in the Middle East had he been allowed to finish his second term. There's nothing that I've seen so far that would dispute that contention.
Let me ask you about this memo right here. Did it strike you as being strange at all that this memo came from the president to Mrs. Nixon? And in the memo, he refers to himself as the president.
Right. Now, Mr. Nixon may wish to, maybe someone will ask him about it someday, but I would make two observations on a memo like that. One, that it, in all likelihood, was dictated late at night in some very busy times when he's trying to get a lot of things done and get organized and get things moving in the White House. And so he also had a lot of things that Mrs. Nixon was doing to help him get organized. And so the memo was dictated in the third person because she was then going to be dealing with the GSA director, and therefore all she would need to do would be to reroute the memo to the GSA director without changing the language. So it may be an example of the efficiency, the administrative efficiency that is certainly an aspect of Richard Nixon. That's an important one to remember. Remember, it was not only H.R. Haldeman, it was very efficient. Hamilton Jordan, I have to interrupt here to say, Hamilton Jordan, during Jimmy Carter's administration, failed to date many of the memos that he wrote President Carter. I mean, I found this out relatively recently, and the archivists, I think we should all be appalled by Mr. Jordan's failure to do that. One thing you have to say about Bob Haldeman is he was extremely efficient, perhaps efficient to a fault, but it was Richard Nixon who wanted and helped and cultivated Bob Haldeman to be his chief of staff. And so Nixon does have a turn of mind that insists upon administrative efficiency. And we'll note that in that memo, going back to that memo again, that raised in there, I believe, the question of having 2 dictaphones by his nightstand. And it was, again, an example of the organization in his mind. One, of course, was for current government business to be transcribed, and the other was to create his diary, which those tapes were not transcribed, but he took them from the White House with them, and those are one of the things that we certainly must all hope that he will deed to the nation, so that in their entirety, so that we can someday be able to study him that much more closely.
Let me ask you about a sense that you may have gotten from watching this thing up closely. After you read all these memos, did you get a sense that the president set the mood and that all the aides around him were marching to his tune, or vice versa?
Richard Nixon ran the Nixon administration. There was a lot of press interest and speculation in the question, for instance, Henry Kissinger's influence and importance on foreign policy. And Henry Kissinger was influential and very important in Gerald Ford's foreign policy. And he certainly would get a point in or two with Richard Nixon, but as I'm sure Dr. Kissinger will acknowledge, Richard Nixon set the tone for foreign policy in the Nixon administration, and Henry Kissinger was simply a spear carrier.
What's the name Oudes? Where did it come from?
Well, it comes from, in French it would be pronounced Oude, and I had an ancestor who was a coachman in Napoleon's army who had defected on the way to Moscow and settled in Central Europe, and then early in this century my grandfather came to the United States, and that's settled in the Chicago area.
How many copies did they print on this, the first printing?
35,000, of which the first printing's about sold out, I understand. I think there's going to be a decision shortly to go to a second printing.
You get any sense of what kind of people bought it?
A variety of people. I've been around to a number of bookstores. You have, for college students or for college faculty members, first of all, this is an excellent tool to, one can just assign this book to a class in modern American politics and say, you know, do you think Richard Nixon should really have been impeached? And the articles of impeachment, in fact, are at the back of the book, so one can go through there and read all the memos and then read the articles or reread, as the case may be, the articles of impeachment. And so it's designed for serious, as a tool to help serious academics, but it can also easily be a coffee table book. One can just read, if one has a few minutes, a few memos and pick up the book a few days later. It's not as though you're getting engrossed in a dense historical tome that is very difficult to pick up again once you've put it down. I mean, this book could be and should be, I think, read through very seriously from front to back, but one can sort of delve into it and just look through it on a lighter basis.
Should one get a sense over on this other page right across here, you run throughout this book in various times editorials from the Grant County Press, Petersburg, West Virginia. Is this your way of giving us what you thought about this at this time?
Well, not really, in a sense. I think it's much more objective than that. The problem of Richard Nixon was, and the question of impeachment and the decision on resignation came about when he finally lost the support of the Republicans in the Senate, who could have blocked an impeachment on a vote. And it's very important for readers to, I think, to understand that and remember that. It was not just, there was no question, but that the witch hunts that were launched, that were taking place inside the White House, begat witch hunts outside the White House. And that Richard Nixon, one talks about Richard Nixon's paranoia. Well, he had reason to believe, certainly after 72 and 73, that a lot of people were after him. The question of whether he was paranoid or not during 73 is certainly one to discuss. There were a lot of people. He was quite accurate in that regard. But it was as these revelations unfolded in 73, editors around the country of small weekly newspapers and others, people around the country, suddenly had to realize that this was a very serious thing. This wasn't just a New York and Washington media event, and that there was some serious anguish going on in the country. And I have a farm in Grant County, West Virginia, and Alice Welton happened to be a longtime editor of the paper, its Republican roots. Abe Lincoln's mother was is said to have been born nearby. It's a Republican enclave in a state that is 2-to-1 Democratic. And I remembered as I went through these documents that Alice had printed some editorials in 73, and so I got the idea of going back. To me, at the time, it was when I first realized the depth of Richard Nixon's difficulty. I would commute from Washington out to West Virginia, and it was not until I read the press and read what Alice was writing that I realized that, whoa, this wasn't something that would be limited to Washington and New York and the big cities, and something that would come across on the network news, but that the crisis was really percolating down to the local level. And when Alice Welton started writing those editorials, it was certainly a clear signal to the Democrats who represent West Virginia in Congress and to all of those who might have read them, and I'm sure there were a lot of other small towns around the country where similar editorials were written, that it was time to seriously proceed with the investigation in the House Judiciary Committee on Nixon. And it just seemed to me appropriate to symbolize, as rather than reprint the New York Times or Washington Post editorials, but to reprint them from a small town weekly.
We only have a couple minutes. At any time in this project, publishing these memos and going through the files, were you ever motivated yourself politically, either for or against Richard Nixon?
I'm really trying to understand him. I hope I've been fair to him through all of this. Sure, I've been motivated politically. I mean, I'm an animal who tries to understand politics. I was president of my high school senior class, and I was also editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. So I was playing both sides of the street at that time, and I made a very conscious decision after that fact that I really didn't want to get into the political debate on one side or the other. And I have some reservations, for instance, about the idea that's being broadcast by many conservatives. It really originated in the Nixon years, that we should have our politics organized along British lines, that is, conservatives on one side and labor and liberals all on the other side. I think the American tradition has been that there should be an important moderate element within the Republican Party and a more important moderate element within the Democratic Party, and that our politics really should be centrist politics. I mean, I think that's the great strength of this country. So, no, I did not have partisan motives. I'm still trying to understand Nixon. Some things I agree with him on, some things I don't.
Our guest for the last hour has been Bruce Oudes. As you can see here, this is this thick 661-page book published by Harper & Row, and it includes many memoranda from the era of 1969 to 1974, written by Richard Nixon and other of his aides. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're quite welcome.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.